So if you had to come up with a poster or a meme that encapsulated a great deal of what we've learned in a comprehensible and easy to remember format, what would you choose? For me, the choice is a diagram that was drawn by the cognitive psychologist Schachter, together with this motto: I see how you reason. Now you might think to yourself, wow, Wallace has really jumped the shark here. What the heck is he talking about? Why is he showing us this picture of two naked guys running down a long hallway? Has he been reading too much Sigmund Freud? What's going on here? Well, this diagram illustrates very nicely the way in which our system 1 operates and the way in which our system 2 operates and the relationship together. So when we look at this diagram, the second figure, the figure that looks like he's farther back in the hallway, seems much larger than the figure at the front of the diagram. In fact, these two figures are exactly the same size. This is an illusion of relative size at depth. So if we look at this diagram carefully, what we realize is that there are a number of cues that together cause our brain to make an inference that the figure at the front of the diagram is much closer to us than the figure at the rear of the diagram, farther back in the tunnel there. And because they're the same size on our retina, our brain then makes this inference that that second figure is in fact much larger than the first figure. And it then makes it so. It makes the two figures appear to be different sizes, even though they're the exact same size. So the two features that are most prominent in this picture for generating this illusion are the convergent parallel lines in the picture. All these different lines here that we see that seem to converge here. Those are cues that our brain uses. So if you were to stand on railroad tracks, and don't stand on railroad tracks, by the way, that's very dangerous, and you were to look down them, they would seem to come together off in the distance. So that perspective is an inferential cue that our brain uses to make inferences about relative distance of objects in our visual field. Similarly, the increased density of the textures on the walls and the floors, that's another cue that our brain looks at that suggests to our brain that the part of the diagram where the textures are relatively spread out, that's closer to us than the part of the diagram where they seem clumped together and hard to differentiate. And so because our brain makes that inference, it then also makes an inference of the relative sizes of these two figures. Now, you may think, no, I think, Wallace, you're just pulling our chain here. So here's a line that goes head to toe on that figure in the back. And here's that line on the figure in the front. They are, in fact, the same size. But even when I tell you that, and even when I draw those lines, you still can't consciously force your brain to see them as being the same size. Those inference patterns are hardwired into their brain. They're part of your brain's operating system. And you can't change that. You can adapt to those things by recognizing their limitations or their inaccuracies at a conscious level. But even that conscious recognition is oftentimes difficult and incomplete. So when we think about that relationship between system 1 and system 2, that metaphor of system 1 being the train that's running down that track in this very rigid, determined, quick fashion that's relatively blind to anything that's in its way. That's how system 1 is operating here. Automatic, reactive inferences that are fast, that are relatively inflexible. I can't change that fact, nor can I change the fact that system 2, the system that provides us with an ability to exert our conscious awareness, to perform oversight functions, to act as the engineer on that train, isn't extraordinarily effective in that role. And so what we discover is that a person's ability to modify those system 1 inference patterns is pretty limited. It's positively but not dramatically influenced by the size of their working memory, by the cues in the context that they're making an inference or decision in. And importantly, by their knowledge of both the limitations of their innate inference strategies and alternative inference strategies that they might employ. So their working memory, the context, and their learned knowledge and skills. So in general, even people with larger working memories are only going to show limited improved general performance, and they're only going to do that when the context of the context helps them to inhibit those system one processes and allows them to then employ an alternative system two strategy that results in a better outcome. So when we think about the challenges and the obstacles to effective inferences and decision making, we realize that as reasoners, we're beset by obstacles and barriers both from outside and from within. So the very complexity of real-world problems is a challenge to our ability to make good inferences and to make good decisions. It's just hard because the world is a complex and variable place. In addition to that, we also have challenges through bad actors, that is, through attempts by other cognitive agents to deceive us or to manipulate us or to take advantage of our inherent cognitive limitations. So there are these external challenges, but there are also these internal barriers. So our innate, automatic, largely unconscious and relatively inflexible human reasoning and decision-making tendencies are the ones that we are strongly biased, strongly disposed to rely on most heavily. And that is fine when they operate in ways that are consistent with their assumptions and they generate, generally speaking, good answers. But whenever those underlying assumptions are violated, then they can lead to systematic errors. And because of our limited working memory capacity, our ability to identify when those innate, automatic, and largely unconscious inference strategies aren't appropriate or lead to systematic errors is in fact highly limited. That provides a second barrier to good inferences from the inside. So we have external challenges and internal barriers to good inference and decision making. Now you might think, well, wait a minute, what about System 2 though? You've hardly even mentioned System 2. Surely you're just trying to scare us and frighten us. Well, not really, right? The moral that we ought to draw, and I'll use Kahneman here to express that moral, is the moral that I've been urging since that very first chapter. So when we look at the historical genesis of the tools necessary for the development and effective use of System 2, what we find is that these abilities and resources are without exception relatively recent, both from a cultural and from an evolutionary perspective. And for that reason, they're pretty difficult for us to utilize systematically and consistently in everyday cognition. But that doesn't mean that it's impossible or hopeless. Instead, what we find and what I've emphasized throughout this course is that while we can't alter the realities of our biological heritage and we can't simplify the world to make inferences and decisions easier, we can nevertheless change or alter the way that we conduct our intellectual lives. And we can achieve modest increases in inference and decision outcomes through heightened awareness of how we process information, by changing how we gather information, by learning alternative inference and decision-making techniques. And those increases can compound across time and across individuals to result in an increased thriving and well-being for ourselves and for all those that we affect. So even though there are limits to our ability to improve our inferences and our decision-making that result from both the complex interaction of our innate dispositions and the nature of the problems that we solve, there still is ability for us to improve, improvements that are in fact quite significant when compounded over time and across individuals. So we can have a positive outcome as a result of our critical thinking studies.